Sometimes a single note can reveal more about a person than 1,000 words ever could. The first piano note was not loud. It did not crash through the ballroom or interrupt the conversations echoing beneath the crystal chandeliers. In fact, many guests barely noticed it at all. Yet somehow, that single note changed everything. The Grand Regent Hotel glittered beneath golden lights on a cool autumn evening in Manhattan. The annual Whitmore Foundation Gala had drawn some of the most influential people in New York. Business leaders, investors, celebrities, politicians. Every table was dressed in white linen. Every glass sparkled. Every detail had been carefully arranged to project elegance and status. At the center of the ballroom stood a magnificent white grand piano worth more than most luxury cars. Soft spotlights illuminated its polished surface, making it appear almost untouchable. Guests admired it from a distance. Nobody approached too closely. Nobody wanted to risk damaging something so valuable. 3-year-old Noah Bennett had no idea how expensive the piano was. He only thought it was beautiful. His small hand slipped free from his mother's grasp while she balanced a silver serving tray nearby. Sarah Bennett immediately noticed. "Noah," she called softly. But toddlers have a special talent for moving quickly whenever adults need them to stand still. Noah wandered across the ballroom floor with curious blue eyes, taking in every detail around him. The towering flowers, the shining chandeliers, the elegant guests dressed like characters from a storybook. Then he saw the piano. His face lit up. To Noah, it looked magical. Sarah's heart skipped. She started moving toward him, careful not to spill the glasses she carried. "Sweetheart, wait." But Noah had already reached the piano. Tiny fingers stretched upward. Guests nearby turned their heads. A few smiled at the sight of the little boy staring in wonder. Then Noah touched a single key. One note floated through the ballroom. Clear, pure, beautiful. The room did not stop. Not yet. Conversations continued. Laughter drifted across the hall. Waiters moved between tables. Yet several people glanced toward the piano. Sarah finally reached the edge of the crowd. Relief washed over her when she saw that nothing had been damaged. It was only one note. One harmless touch from an innocent child. She was already preparing to guide Noah away when another voice cut through the room. Sharp, cold, impossible to ignore. "What do you think you're doing?" Heads turned instantly. Victoria Sinclair stood several feet away, her silver evening gown catching the ballroom lights. As the fiancée of billionaire Daniel Whitmore, she carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to attention. Her expression hardened as she stared at the toddler standing beside the piano. Noah looked up, confused. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Victoria crossed the floor in measured steps. The nearby conversations began fading one by one. Guests sensed drama. People always did. Sarah set her tray down quickly and stepped forward. "I am sorry," she said politely. "He is only 3. Victoria's eyes remained fixed on the piano, then on Noah, then on Sarah's waitress uniform. Something changed in her expression, something that made several nearby guests visibly uncomfortable. Noah rested his small hand on the edge of the piano and smiled, completely unaware of the tension growing around him. He thought everyone was looking at the instrument. He did not realize they were looking at him. The ballroom seemed to grow quieter with every passing second. Somewhere across the room, billionaire Daniel Whitmore paused in the middle of a conversation and glanced toward the gathering crowd. And beside the piano, under the glow of 1,000 crystal reflections, Victoria Sinclair took one more step forward and opened her mouth to speak. Noah blinked up at Victoria with the open curiosity that only a 3-year-old could possess. He did not see a powerful socialite standing before him. He did not understand wealth, status, or reputation. He only saw another adult, another face in a room filled with strangers. Victoria stopped beside the piano and folded her arms. Her voice carried farther than she probably intended. "This piano is not a toy." The words themselves were not cruel. It was the way she said them. The sharpness, the judgment, the assumption that everyone present should already agree with her. Sarah stepped closer and gently placed a hand on Noah's shoulder. "I apologize," she said calmly. "He was only curious." Noah looked up at his mother. "I like the shiny piano." A few guests smiled despite themselves. Sarah gave him a small, reassuring nod. "I know, sweetheart." For a moment, it seemed the situation might end there. One misunderstanding. One awkward moment. Nothing more. Then Victoria noticed Sarah's apron and server badge. Her expression changed slightly. The change was subtle, but enough. "You brought your child to a formal gala?" she asked. Several nearby guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Sarah remained composed. "I did not have anyone available to watch him tonight." Victoria glanced around the ballroom. "This is exactly why events like this have standards." The comment landed harder than she realized. Noah did not understand the words. Sarah did. Yet she refused to react. Years of working service jobs had taught her something important. Sometimes dignity was simply refusing to become the argument someone wanted. "We will move away from the piano," Sarah said softly. "Thank you." She reached for Noah's hand. The toddler nodded obediently. But before they could leave, Noah looked back at the piano one last time. His eyes widened with fascination. "It sings." A few guests laughed quietly. Not at him. At the innocence of the observation. Noah genuinely believed the piano was singing. Victoria, however, appeared less amused. "Children need boundaries," she said, "especially in places they do not belong." This time the silence that followed felt different. Heavier. Several people lowered their eyes. Others stared into their drinks. Nobody wanted to challenge the fiancé of Daniel Whitmore. Yet many clearly wished she had not said it. Sarah felt a brief ache in her chest. Not for herself. For Noah. One day he would be old enough to understand words like those. One day he would realize how quickly people judged others based on appearance. But today was not that day. Today he still believed most people were kind. Sarah intended to protect that belief for as long as possible. She knelt beside him and adjusted his tiny jacket. "Ready to help Mommy for a little while?" Noah smiled immediately. "Can I carry napkins?" "Maybe just one napkin." His face lit up as if she had given him a great responsibility. Across the ballroom, Daniel Whitmore continued watching from a distance. He could not hear every word being spoken, but he could read expressions. He noticed Sarah's calmness. He noticed Noah's innocence. Most of all, he noticed something else. Nearly everyone around the piano seemed uncomfortable except Victoria. Before he could move closer, another sound suddenly drifted through the ballroom. It came from the far side of the room. An elderly man seated near one of the tables had slowly risen to his feet. His eyes remained fixed on Noah. Not on Sarah. Not on Victoria. On Noah. Specifically on the piano. The old man's expression carried something unexpected. Not annoyance. Not concern. Recognition. As if the single note Noah had played only moments earlier had awakened a memory buried deep in the past. The elderly man remained standing long after everyone else had returned to their conversations. His silver hair caught the chandelier light as he stared toward the piano with unusual intensity. Most guests recognized him immediately. Arthur Calloway, one of the most respected concert pianists in America, a man whose performances had filled Carnegie Hall for decades. Even in retirement, musicians still spoke his name with admiration. Arthur took a slow step forward, then another. His eyes never left the white piano. More specifically, they never left the spot where Noah had pressed a single key only moments earlier. Daniel Whitmore noticed the movement as well. Arthur was not known for dramatic behavior. If something had captured his attention, there was usually a reason. Meanwhile, Sarah gently guided Noah toward a quieter section of the ballroom. The little boy happily carried one folded napkin in both hands, as if it were an important assignment. His earlier encounter with Victoria already seemed forgotten. Children had a remarkable ability to move on from moments that adults carried for years. "Am I helping?" Noah asked proudly. Sarah smiled. "You are helping very much." Noah grinned. Then he noticed the elderly pianist approaching. "Mom, that man is looking at me." Sarah glanced over her shoulder. Arthur Calloway was indeed walking directly toward them. Several guests began paying attention again. The tension that had briefly faded returned to the room. Arthur finally stopped in front of Noah. His expression was not judgmental. If anything, it seemed thoughtful. Curious. "Hello there," he said warmly. Noah immediately held up the napkin. "I am working." A few nearby guests laughed softly. Arthur smiled. "I can see that." Then he crouched slightly so he could speak at eye level. "May I ask you something?" Noah nodded. "Did you play the piano?" "Just one note." Arthur's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Why that note?" Noah blinked. The question seemed strange to him. "Because it was the pretty one." Arthur did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked toward the piano again. His expression grew more serious. Across the ballroom, Victoria appeared increasingly irritated by the attention the child was receiving. What should have been a forgotten incident was becoming something else entirely. Daniel, meanwhile, had quietly moved closer. Not close enough to interfere, just close enough to listen. Arthur looked back at Noah. Would you show me something? Sarah immediately shook her head. I do not want him causing any more problems. Arthur turned toward her. Trust me. There was kindness in his voice. Respect. The kind of respect Sarah had not received from everyone that evening. Arthur stood and offered his hand toward Noah. The toddler looked up at his mother. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Only for a moment. Noah happily took Arthur's hand. Together they walked back toward the piano. Conversation slowed once again. Guests began watching openly now, some out of curiosity, others because Arthur Calloway almost never drew attention to anyone, especially not a 3-year-old child. When they reached the piano, Arthur gently lifted Noah onto the bench. The little boy's feet dangled far above the floor. Arthur pointed toward the keys. Can you find the pretty note again? Noah looked down at the keyboard. Hundreds of polished white and black keys stretched before him. He studied them carefully. Then, without hesitation, he reached out and pressed a single key. The same note rang through the ballroom. Arthur closed his eyes. A strange expression crossed his face. Not surprise. Recognition. As though he had just heard the opening word of a sentence he once knew by heart. When he opened his eyes again, they were fixed on Noah. And for the first time that evening, Arthur Calloway looked genuinely stunned. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Arthur Calloway remained beside the piano, his eyes fixed on Noah as if he were trying to solve a mystery that had suddenly appeared in front of him. The note still lingered in his memory. Not because it was extraordinary, not because it was difficult, but because of the way the child had chosen it. 3-year-olds did not normally select specific notes twice in a row from 88 keys. They pressed whatever was closest, whatever looked interesting. Yet Noah had reached for the exact same note both times without hesitation. Arthur slowly sat down beside him on the piano bench. Noah, he said gently, do you like music? Noah nodded immediately. Music lives in our apartment. Several guests smiled at the answer. Arthur smiled too. Does it? Mom plays songs. Sarah looked surprised. I do not play songs. Noah shook his head. You do when you clean. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Sarah felt her cheeks warm slightly. For the first time that evening, some of the tension around her began to soften. Arthur looked toward her. You sing? Sarah shrugged. Only around the apartment. Arthur nodded thoughtfully. Then he turned back toward Noah. Would you like to play another note? Noah looked at his mother. Sarah hesitated. The attention made her uncomfortable. She had come to work, not become the center of a ballroom full of wealthy strangers. Yet Arthur's kindness reassured her. Finally she nodded. Noah smiled and returned his attention to the keyboard. Tiny fingers hovered above the keys. Arthur remained silent. So did everyone else. Even Victoria, though visibly annoyed by the growing interest surrounding the child. Noah pressed another key, then another. The notes were simple, separate, unpolished. Yet something changed in Arthur's expression almost immediately. Daniel Whitmore noticed it from only a few feet away. Arthur leaned slightly forward. The elderly pianist was listening with complete concentration. Noah pressed a third note, then a fourth. The sequence lasted only seconds. But when it ended, Arthur slowly closed his eyes. A memory had surfaced. A melody. A fragment of something he had not heard in years. When he opened his eyes again, they seemed almost emotional. That is impossible, he whispered. Daniel stepped closer. What is impossible? Arthur looked up at him. Those notes. Daniel frowned. What about them? Arthur glanced back at Noah. He is not choosing them randomly. Victoria let out a short laugh. He is 3 years old. Arthur did not even look at her. Exactly. The answer unsettled more people than it should have. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself. She suddenly felt as if events were moving beyond her understanding. Arthur rose from the bench and slowly approached her. Mrs. Bennet, he said, has Noah ever had piano lessons? Sarah blinked. No, never. We cannot afford piano lessons. Arthur studied her face carefully, searching for any sign she was joking. There was none. Does he have access to a piano? Sarah hesitated. An old keyboard. Arthur's eyes narrowed. Where? At home. Who gave it to him? For a brief moment, Sarah's expression changed. A shadow of memory crossed her face. It belonged to my father. Arthur froze. The ballroom seemed quieter than ever. Daniel noticed it immediately. So did several guests nearby. Arthur looked toward the piano again, then back at Sarah. His voice became almost reverent. "What was your father's name?" Sarah lowered her eyes for a second, then answered softly, "Michael Bennett." The reaction was immediate. Arthur's face lost all color. Daniel stared at him in confusion. Victoria stopped smiling. And near the piano, Noah simply swung his little legs above the floor, completely unaware that the name his mother had just spoken had changed the entire room. The silence that followed seemed almost impossible. A moment earlier, the ballroom had been filled with quiet conversations and polite laughter. Now hundreds of people stood motionless, watching Arthur Calloway stare at Sarah Bennett as though she had just revealed something extraordinary. Daniel Whitmore stepped closer. "You know that name?" Arthur let out a slow breath. For several seconds, he seemed lost in memory. Then he nodded. Everyone in the classical music world knew that name. Sarah looked genuinely surprised. "My father was never famous." Arthur's expression softened. "That depends on how you define famous." The guests surrounding them listened carefully. Even those who had never heard of Michael Bennett sensed they were witnessing something important. Arthur glanced toward the white, grand piano. 30 years ago, your father wrote a composition that many musicians believed would become one of the great modern piano works." Sarah frowned slightly. She had never heard this story. "What composition?" Arthur looked at her with disbelief. "You truly do not know?" Sarah slowly shook her head. Arthur gave a small, saddened smile. Then he never talked about it. Daniel watched the exchange with growing curiosity. Victoria folded her arms nearby. Her confidence had begun to fade, replaced by uncertainty. Arthur continued. "The piece was never officially published. Only fragments survived." His eyes moved toward Noah. "One of those fragments began with the exact sequence of notes your son just played." A murmur spread through the room. Sarah stared at Noah. The toddler sat happily on the piano bench, swinging his feet and studying the chandelier above him. He looked completely disconnected from the extraordinary conversation happening around him. "That cannot be possible," Sarah said quietly. Arthur nodded. "That is exactly what I thought." Daniel looked toward Noah. "You believe he recognized the melody?" Arthur shook his head. "No, he is too young for that." The pianist paused. "What I believe is even stranger." The room grew quiet again. Arthur slowly walked back toward the piano. Michael Bennett was known for something unusual. He gently rested a hand on the polished instrument. He believed musical instinct could run through families the way other traits do. Sarah blinked. "You mean talent?" "Not talent." Arthur looked toward Noah. "Recognition." Those words settled heavily over the crowd. Sarah remembered countless evenings at home. Noah climbing onto the old keyboard. Noah pressing keys while humming softly to himself. Noah smiling whenever music filled the apartment. She had always assumed he was simply a curious child. Nothing more. Arthur turned back toward Noah. "May I try something?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Arthur sat beside the toddler. He placed his fingers on the keys and played 4 notes. Simple, gentle, incomplete. Then he stopped. The unfinished phrase lingered in the air. Everyone waited. Noah tilted his head. He listened. Then, without instruction, without encouragement, and without hesitation, his tiny hand reached toward the keyboard. One finger pressed a single key, then another. The melody continued exactly where Arthur had stopped. Gasps echoed throughout the ballroom. Arthur froze. Daniel stared at the keyboard. Several guests covered their mouths in disbelief. Noah simply smiled. "That sounds better." Arthur slowly removed his hands from the piano. His eyes had become glassy with emotion. For the second time that evening, he looked completely stunned. And across the ballroom, Victoria Sinclair suddenly realized that the child she had dismissed only minutes earlier was becoming the center of attention in a room full of people who no longer seemed interested in anything else. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The final notes still hung in the air like a question nobody knew how to answer. Noah looked around the ballroom, confused by the sudden silence. "Did I do it right?" he asked. Arthur Calloway smiled gently. "You did something remarkable." Noah seemed pleased by that answer. Then he immediately became distracted by the reflection of the chandelier on the piano lid. The simplicity of his attention somehow made the moment even more extraordinary. Around him, adults were struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Daniel Whitmore stepped closer to the piano. He looked first at Arthur, then at Sarah, then finally at the little boy. "Can someone explain what just happened?" Arthur remained seated for a moment, gathering his thoughts. The melody Noah completed was never published. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? Arthur folded his hands. It means there is no recording. No sheet music available to the public. No online version. Almost nobody alive remembers it. A quiet murmur passed through the crowd. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Then how could he know it? Arthur looked toward Noah. That is the question. Sarah glanced at her son. The toddler was now carefully counting piano keys with one finger, completely unaware that he had become the center of an increasingly mysterious conversation. Daniel studied the child for a moment. Then his attention shifted to Sarah. Tell me about your father. Sarah hesitated. She rarely spoke about him. Not because she was ashamed. Because the memories still felt personal. Precious. He died when I was young, she said softly. I remember music. I remember people visiting our house. I remember him spending hours at the piano. Arthur nodded slowly. That sounds like Michael. Sarah looked surprised. You really knew him? Arthur smiled sadly. Not just knew him. He glanced toward the piano. I admired him. The honesty in his voice caught everyone off guard. Arthur Calloway was a legend. The idea that he had admired someone else seemed almost impossible. Your father had a gift, Arthur continued. Not only as a musician, as a composer. Sarah listened quietly. Daniel did the same. Victoria stood several feet away, increasingly isolated from the center of attention she normally commanded. Nobody was looking at her anymore. Nobody seemed interested in her opinion. Arthur's voice softened. There was one composition he never finished. He called it The Promise. Sarah blinked. The name sounded strangely familiar. Then a memory surfaced. An old notebook. A faded page. A melody scribbled in pencil. Something her father used to keep near the family piano. I remember that title, she whispered. Arthur nodded. Very few people do. Daniel looked toward Noah again. You believe that melody came from that composition? I am certain of it. The answer sent another wave of silence through the room. Sarah felt overwhelmed. Not by pride. Not by excitement. By confusion. Nothing about the evening made sense anymore. She had arrived expecting to work a shift and earn a paycheck. Instead, strangers were discussing her father as though he belonged in history books. Noah suddenly looked up. Mom. Sarah smiled immediately. Yes, sweetheart. He pointed toward the piano keys. The song feels happy. Arthur's eyes widened. Daniel noticed. What? Arthur let out a slow breath. Michael used to say that exact thing. Sarah stared at him. What? Arthur nodded. Whenever someone asked him to describe music, he never talked about technique. The elderly pianist looked toward Noah. He said songs have feelings before they have notes. No one moved. No one spoke. The room had become strangely still. Because for the second time that evening, a 3-year-old child had echoed something that belonged to a man he had never met. And for the first time, even Daniel Whitmore began to wonder whether this night was leading toward a truth far bigger than anyone had imagined. The longer the silence lasted, the more uncomfortable it became for certain people in the room. Not because anyone was arguing, not because anyone was angry, but because a story was beginning to emerge, and many of the assumptions made earlier in the evening were quietly falling apart. Sarah Bennett stood beside the piano, her attention fixed entirely on Noah. While others debated music, history, and coincidence, she saw only her son. A little boy with untied shoelaces who still needed help reaching the sink at home. The idea that he might somehow be connected to something extraordinary felt impossible to her. Yet the expressions around the room told a different story. Arthur Calloway slowly rose from the piano bench. There is something else, he said. His voice was calm, but everyone heard it. Daniel Whitmore folded his arms. What is it? Arthur glanced toward Sarah. Your father kept journals. Sarah nodded cautiously. I remember seeing notebooks. Hundreds of pages. Arthur smiled faintly. He wrote down melodies. Thoughts. Observations. Sarah listened carefully. Arthur continued. One entry stayed with me all these years. He looked toward Noah. Michael believed that children often hear things adults forget. The ballroom remained completely quiet. Arthur took a slow breath. Most people thought he was speaking metaphorically. Daniel raised an eyebrow. And now? Arthur smiled. Now I am not so sure. Victoria shifted uncomfortably near the edge of the crowd. Earlier, she had controlled the conversation. Earlier, she had been the most important person standing beside that piano. Now nobody seemed interested in her opinion at all. The room had moved on without her. Noah looked up at Arthur. What is metaphorically? A wave of soft laughter passed through the guests. Arthur chuckled. It means saying one thing, but meaning another. Noah thought about that for a second. That sounds confusing. Even Daniel smiled. The tension eased slightly. Arthur nodded. Sometimes it is. Noah seemed satisfied. Then he placed both hands on the piano bench and leaned forward. My grandpa liked music? Sarah's expression softened immediately. She had spoken about her father only a handful of times around Noah. Arthur crouched beside him. Very much. Noah smiled. Then I think I would like him. The simplicity of the statement hit the room harder than anyone expected. Sarah lowered her eyes briefly. Emotion flickered across her face. Not dramatic. Not overwhelming. Just real. Daniel noticed. So did Arthur. There was a dignity in the way she carried herself. No attempt to impress anyone. No effort to claim attention. She simply stood beside her son. Arthur looked toward Daniel. The foundation supports young musicians, correct? Daniel nodded. That is one of our largest programs. Arthur smiled faintly. Then perhaps tonight accomplished more than we planned. Daniel followed his gaze toward Noah. The little boy was now examining the piano pedals with complete fascination. A future donor, investor, or celebrity could have stood in front of him, and he would not have noticed. He was too busy being 3 years old. Daniel found himself unexpectedly moved by that. Around them, conversations remained suspended. Guests were waiting. Not for another performance. Not for another revelation. For understanding. Somehow everyone sensed there was still one piece missing. One truth that had not fully emerged. Then Noah suddenly looked up at his mother. Mom. Yes, sweetheart. Can we listen to Grandpa's music when we get home? Sarah smiled. If I can find it. Noah nodded seriously. I think the piano remembers it. The room fell silent again. Not because the statement proved anything. Not because it explained anything. But because somewhere deep inside, everyone felt the same thing. A child had touched a piano. And somehow, in the process, he had awakened memories that an entire room of adults had forgotten. The atmosphere inside the ballroom had changed completely. Earlier in the evening, people had gathered to celebrate wealth, philanthropy, and influence. Now they stood in small circles speaking quietly about something entirely different. A forgotten composer, a remarkable child, and a waitress who seemed increasingly connected to a story no one had expected to hear. Daniel Whitmore remained near the piano. The Foundation Gala was technically his event, yet he no longer felt like the central figure in the room. Strangely, he did not mind. He found himself watching Sarah Bennett with growing respect. Throughout the evening, she had never demanded attention. She had never tried to impress anyone. Even now, with dozens of influential people focused on her family, she appeared almost uncomfortable with the spotlight. Arthur Calloway slowly turned toward the crowd. There is something all of you should understand. His voice carried naturally through the room. Conversations stopped immediately. Michael Bennett was not merely a talented composer. Arthur glanced toward Sarah. He was one of the most original musical minds I ever encountered. Sarah lowered her eyes. Hearing strangers speak about her father in that way felt overwhelming. Arthur continued. When he passed away, many of us believed his unfinished work had disappeared forever. Daniel listened carefully. So did everyone else. Arthur's gaze shifted toward Noah. Tonight, for the first time in decades, I heard a piece of that work again. The statement sent a visible ripple through the audience. Several guests exchanged astonished looks. Others stared at the child sitting near the piano bench. Noah, meanwhile, had become fascinated by a decorative gold tassel hanging from a nearby curtain. The contrast between the seriousness of the conversation and the innocence of the toddler made the moment even more powerful. Sarah finally spoke. I still do not understand how any of this is possible. Arthur nodded. Neither do I. The honesty surprised everyone. But I know what I heard. Daniel glanced toward the piano. Could there be old recordings somewhere? Sarah thought for a moment. Then a memory surfaced. There are boxes in storage. Arthur immediately looked interested. Boxes? My father's things. Sarah shrugged lightly. I never opened most of them. Arthur smiled sadly. Sometimes history waits in places nobody thinks to look. Daniel found himself unexpectedly inspired by the idea. For years his foundation had funded music education programs. Yet standing here tonight, he realized something important. Great stories did not always begin in prestigious schools or concert halls. Sometimes they began in small apartments. Sometimes they survived because a family quietly carried them forward without realizing their value. Across the ballroom, Victoria Sinclair stood alone. Earlier, she had spoken with confidence. Earlier, she had assumed she understood exactly who belonged near the piano and who did not. Now she watched guests gather around Sarah with admiration and curiosity. Nobody was criticizing Victoria. Nobody needed to. The contrast spoke for itself. Sarah had never defended herself. She had never argued. She had simply stood beside her child. And somehow that had become the most powerful statement in the room. Noah suddenly tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom." Sarah smiled immediately. "Yes." "Are people happy?" The question caught her off guard. "What do you mean?" Noah pointed toward the guests surrounding them. They looked different now. Sarah followed his gaze. Arthur was smiling. Daniel was smiling. Even strangers who had never met her seemed warmer than before. "I think they are," she said softly. Noah nodded. Then he looked toward the piano. "Good." Arthur watched the exchange in silence. Then something occurred to him. A possibility. A memory connected to Michael Bennett's unfinished composition. Slowly, he turned back toward Sarah. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet sense of wonder. "There may be one more thing your father left behind that nobody has discovered yet." The room seemed to lean forward as Arthur Calloway spoke those final words. "There may be one more thing your father left behind that nobody has discovered yet." Sarah stared at him. "What do you mean?" Arthur looked toward the piano, then back at her. "Michael often spoke about finishing the promise someday." His voice softened. But he also believed certain pieces of music arrived when the right person was ready to hear them. Several guests exchanged thoughtful glances. Daniel Whitmore remained silent, listening carefully. Arthur smiled faintly. "At the time, I thought it was simply the way artists talked." He looked toward Noah. "Tonight, I am not so sure." The little boy had climbed down from the piano bench and was now standing beside his mother, holding her hand. His earlier excitement had faded into sleepy contentment. It had been a long evening for someone who still measured life in snack times and bedtime stories. Sarah brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. "I still have those boxes," she said quietly. "Everything my father left behind." Arthur nodded. "Then perhaps his story is not finished after all." Daniel glanced around the ballroom. The atmosphere felt entirely different from the one that had existed only an hour earlier. The expensive decorations remained. The elegant gowns remained. The crystal chandeliers still reflected golden light across polished marble floors. Yet none of those things seemed important anymore. The center of attention was no longer wealth. It was legacy, memory, family. Daniel turned toward Sarah. "If you are willing, the Whitmore Foundation would be honored to help preserve your father's work." Sarah blinked in surprise. "Why?" Daniel smiled. "Because some gifts should not disappear." Arthur nodded in agreement. Around them, guests quietly murmured their approval. Nobody applauded. The moment felt too personal for that. Across the room, Victoria Sinclair stood motionless. Earlier, she had looked at Sarah and Noah and seen people who did not belong. Now she watched an entire ballroom gathered around them with respect. For the first time all evening, she seemed to understand what had happened. The room had not changed because of status. It had changed because the truth had emerged. Sarah had never argued. She had never demanded fairness. She had simply remained herself. Noah tugged gently on her sleeve. "Mom." "Yes, sweetheart." He pointed toward the piano one last time. "Can it stay happy?" Sarah smiled. "I think so." Arthur overheard the question and laughed softly. "That may be the best review that piano has ever received." Even Daniel laughed. The tension that had filled the evening finally dissolved. Guests began speaking again, though more quietly than before. Something about the experience had humbled them. Before leaving, Arthur approached Noah one final time. "Young man," he said gently. "Thank you." Noah looked confused. "For what?" Arthur smiled. "For reminding us to listen." Noah considered that answer carefully. Then he nodded as though it made perfect sense. Sarah took her son's hand and prepared to return home. No grand speech followed. No dramatic announcement. No sudden transformation. Just a mother and her child walking toward the exit beneath the warm glow of chandeliers. Yet as they crossed the ballroom, people stepped aside with quiet respect. Not because of who they were. Because of what they had revealed. Daniel watched them go. Arthur did too. And somewhere behind them, the white grand piano sat silently beneath the lights, no longer just a symbol of wealth or elegance. It had become a reminder that talent can appear where nobody expects it, that dignity speaks louder than pride, and that sometimes the smallest hand in the room can touch far more than a piano. It can awaken something forgotten in every heart that hears it.